Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and just get started. It's 12 o'clock, so we have a bunch of people in here, and we're just going to start with our 1099 review and Q&A. So I have a little presentation here that I'm going to start with, but feel free either during or after I'm done to ask any questions and any situations that come up that you can think of that you've had questions about, and whether or not to issue a 1099 or what to do in a certain circumstance. Definitely keep those questions, and I'll be happy to answer them at the end. So today we're going to talk about what a 1099 is, what a W-9 is, why we were required to issue 1099s to vendors in the first place, when 1099s are due, which vendors don't need to be issued 1099s, whether or not 1099s show up on the actual tax return, what will happen if you're ever audited and didn't 1099 anyone or everyone that you should have, and some 2022 1099 changes. So first, let's just talk about what a 1099 actually is. So this is the document. It's just one form that a business owner issues to each vendor, contractor, or subcontractor that provides them a service for their business, not merchandise or goods. So this is strictly only for services that are provided to you. So the 1099 you issue to the vendor is essentially the receipt for the transactions that happened during that year. And it's an annual filing, so it's only filed once a year. It's due on the 31st of January every year for the previous year. So coming up in January 2023, we're going to be preparing 1099 NECs, non-employee compensation forms, for all vendors that were paid in 2022 more than $600 in total. So there's three main forms that fall into the quote unquote 1099 category. The most common is the non-employee compensation, this form that we're staring at here, which just captures any work that subcontractors or vendors did for you during the year who weren't actually employees on W-2 payroll. The other less common but still used 1099s or 1099 miscellaneous, which is most commonly issued to anyone that you paid rent to in the calendar year. You can see the very first box here is strictly for rents that were paid. And then also the 1099 interest statement. And this would be issued to anyone that you paid interest to in the calendar year, except for banks and credit card companies, because those are corporations and they're actually not required to be issued a 1099. So we'll talk about that more later as well. So all 1099s include your business name as the payer or the issuing entity, the recipient's name, whether that's an individual that you paid or a business, and then their corresponding identification number. So if you paid an individual, you're going to put on the 1099 their social security number. And if you paid a business, you're going to put on their EIN. So you want to keep that consistent. If you're strictly paying a business the entire year, you want to make sure you issue the 1099 to the business that you were paying and using the EIN for that business as well. We've been seeing more and more notices come out after 1099s are issued that we have a mismatch between the actual EIN and the name of the business, and that's usually because we've used the individual social security number and the business name combo instead of the business and EIN. And obviously also on that 1099, we need their address and the amount that you paid them during the year. So that's 1099. Let's talk about something else that kind of corresponds with the 1099, and that's a W-9. And a W-9 is actually the document that you collect from the vendor or the person or the business that you're paying. And on the W-9 should be their name or their business name and their corresponding social and EIN. And it should also have their address and their entity type. And these things are very important to get before you issue payment, because it will not only show you who you should be issuing the payment to, but also whether or not you'll need to 1099 them at the end of the year. So the W-9, the most important thing on the W-9 is their entity classification. And if they're not required to be 1099 because of that, you can kind of put them in a separate pile where you don't need to worry about following how much you paid them during the year. and needing to issue a 1099. So here's the W-9, kind of the snapshot of the top half, which basically has everything that we're looking for. So on the W-9, at the very top is going to be the name. So whether this is, again, the individual vendor's name or the business name. And then in box 3 is the area where they're going to tell us how they're set up. So whether they're set up as an individual or sole prop or a single member LLC, or if they're set up directly as a C Corp, an S Corp, or a multi-member entity like a partnership. And then the other checkbox that is most commonly used here is the limited liability company, because most commonly you're an LLC taxed as an S corporation. So again, also not required to be 1099. So that's why these W-9s are so important to get beforehand, because often we'll have people trying to issue 1099s in January. They're just getting W-9s from people that they paid all of 2022. And then they come to realize that they actually didn't need to 1099 that person at all anyway, because they're set up as a limited liability tax as a corp, or they're set up as a corporation directly. So all that chasing down and trying to follow up for the information was all for nothing anyway, because they didn't need to actually issue a 1099. So this is really important to have on file for any vendor that kind of fits the classification of providing your business a service, because there's a good chance that they might need a 1099 at the end of the year. And the only way to really know is to collect the information on the W-9 from them. Let's talk about why we're even required to 1099 vendors. So a business needs to issue 1099s to be able to deduct the expense against your business profit. Like I said before, it essentially acts as a receipt. And it's another way for the IRS to double check that the expense that you're taking on your books against your business profit is also picked up as income on the tax return of someone else. In this case, the vendor that you're paying. 1099s are due on January 31st of every year for the previous calendar year. So as an example, 2022's 1099s are going to be due on January 31st, 2023. And we've already kind of touched on it, but let's talk more about which vendors do not need 1099. So if you find out based on the W-9 that the business that you're paying is set up as an S Corp or a C Corp, that's great news, because those entities don't need to be 1099. The IRS essentially exempts those entities from needing to receive 1099s because they're already subject to more strict state and federal reporting requirements. So that's why they don't require you to be issuing 1099s to every vendor that you come in contact with. Only those that they might basically have a chance of slipping through the cracks. So do the 1099s even show up anywhere on my tax return? This is a question we get all the time. So I've captured a snapshot of the top half of a Schedule C, which is the business return for a single member LLC or a sole proprietor. But the same question is on every corp and partnership return as well. In this section towards the bottom, did you make any payments in 2022 that would require you to file Form 1099? Every return that we file for every client, we have to answer either yes or no to that question. And as soon as we answer yes to the question that we did have enough payments that we should have issued a 1099, we also have to answer whether or not we properly filed those 1099s that we were required to. And by answering this simple question, the IRS can easily tell if you actually did what you were supposed to do and issued the 1099s, because they can do a lookup of your EIN and see if the EIN that answered the question on the corresponding business return actually filed any 1099s. So yes, they very much so show up on the tax return. And it's a very easily provable question for the IRS. And the 1099s kind of also show up, quote unquote, on your tax return in the form of business expenses, because again, we're reducing the business profit that you have by taking those vendor expenses against it. So in order to take the expense and use it to reduce your income, you need a receipt. So you should issue a 1099 to that vendor. If you just want to pay cash and check and you don't want to issue a 1099 because you're just helping your buddy out, you should probably think twice before taking that expense on the books, because if you ever have to prove it to an IRS auditor, you're going to have a hard time explaining what actually happened. And that leads me to what happens if you are audited and didn't 1099 everyone or anyone that you actually should have. So there's an immediate penalty. As soon as the IRS comes in and audits you and finds out that there are 1099s that should have been issued that weren't, there is a penalty by form for the 1099s that were not issued. And you also might be subject to the actual self-employment taxes that your vendor should have paid on income if they didn't claim that's income on their return because a 1099 wasn't produced. So if you should have issued a 1099 for $10,000, your vendor didn't claim that $10,000 that they received from you because they didn't have a 1099, so they figured it wasn't going to be taxable, and you're found out, you might actually be on the hook for the self-employment taxes on that $10,000. The IRS can charge your company a penalty of $30 to $100 per form that should have been filed. I said, wow. The amount depends on how long past the deadline the company issues the form. If a company intentionally disregards the requirement to provide a 1099, it's subject to a minimum penalty of $250 per form. So I don't know how many 1099s you're used to issuing every year, but you just factor in how much on average you issue multiplied by $250. If you intentionally disregarded your filing requirement of those 1099s, that's a hefty penalty that you might pay per form. Again, in addition to potential self-employment taxes that weren't paid on that income. So there's been talk in 2022 about some changes to 1099s and how that's affecting people and small businesses and third parties and all those kind of situations that we're hearing. But the truth is, from a taxability standpoint, nothing has changed. Everything that's used to be taxable is still taxable. Business income is still taxable whether or not you receive a 1099 or not. The only difference is that third-party payment processors, think like Venmo, Stripe, Square, PayPal, there is another form called a 1099-K that those processors had to issue if there was more than 200 transactions in a year or more than $20,000 in sales. So for a lot of small businesses, they didn't hit these numbers, right? They might use Venmo for a couple things, they might use PayPal for a couple things, but collectively, they probably didn't hit that 200 or 20,000 in sales every year. So 1099s weren't issued. But the change is that that $20,000 number has been reduced to $600, just like the 1099 non-employee compensation. So people are all up in arms saying that this is going to cause such a headache for all these smaller businesses who are receiving payments because they're going to be taxed on personal transactions that went through their Venmo and such, like things like that. But the truth is, those things are never taxable. Any personal Venmo payments that are going back and forth are actually not even included in this. The 1099-Ks are only supposed to be issued for business Venmo payments. So again, nothing from a taxability standpoint has changed, but there are going to be a lot more 1099-Ks that are issued this year because that amount was reduced so drastically from $20,000 to $600. So people that underreported their income in the past because they used Cash App or Venmo or PayPal friends and family, and they were able to get away with receiving money, but not actually paying tax on it, they have a decision to make. The 1099-K doesn't automatically mean that the IRS will be looking for that amount on their tax return because the 1099-K represents the gross amount that goes through those payment processors. It doesn't account for things like returns and discounts and refunds. So the IRS knows not to trust that one for one like it should with a 1099 NEC, but there's also some logic that has to be put behind this and some thought, I guess, behind this. If you get a 1099-K issued for $25,000 saying that the credit card processor processed $25,000 for you, but you only report sales of $2,000, you can expect a letter because there's obviously a huge discrepancy and the IRS is going to think you're trying to get out of paying tax on $23,000. So let's talk about some situational questions because these things come up often and it's frustrating for some people because vendors don't answer or people aren't getting you the info after you already paid them. And then the business owner is kind of stuck with like, well, what do I do? Do I not deduct the expense? How risk averse am I? And do I just want to leave those expenses off of my tax return if the vendor won't actually answer me? So there's a lot of ways we can handle things, but let's just go through a couple common scenarios, and hopefully that'll answer some questions and also give you some best practices going forward as to how to handle these vendor payments and 1099s. So the most common thing that happens, and that's why I keep reiterating, get W-9s before you pay vendors. But what happens if I already paid a vendor and I don't have a W-9 for them? So what I always tell people is to track these people down, DM them, call them, try to get their W-9. You might be able to piece together their name, their business name, address, phone number. The problem is their social security number or EIN is not going to be that easy to find just by Google searching. So that's why the W-9 is so important, because these are obviously very important protected personal identification numbers, and they're not just floating around. So it's not as easy just to issue them a 1099 without their input. It's usually easiest just to get it directly from the vendor before paying them, because that avoids the whole ghosting and people just kind of disappearing until the end of January when 1099s aren't due anymore. Most business owners understand that they're supposed to claim income regardless of whether or not there's a paper trail and whether or not there's a 1099 that they received, but there are definitely vendors that will ghost you after a payment thinking that they don't need to actually pay tax if they don't get a 1099. What happens if I already paid the vendor, but I don't have a W-9 and they still aren't answering me? So going forward, always get the W-9 first. Now, the best thing that we can do, especially if you're still planning to take the expense, is to prove that you attempted to collect their information and issue the 1099, like we're going to say you did on the first page of your tax return. So keep any records of emails, phone calls, texts, DMs, anything that goes unanswered from that vendor, so that you can prove to the IRS, if they ever ask, that you attempted to, before the filing deadline, reach out to them and get the information so that you can actually issue the 1099. That's going to be the best way to substantiate the expense if you are ever audited. We do recommend that you can still take the expense against your income and just hope you never get audited. But of course, that is a decision that is up to you depending on your risk tolerance. I do think that the best thing you can do is keep records of any screenshots, anything that you can in a folder that says, I tried to reach out to this person, I tried to get their information, and they just would not respond. And also, something that we see happens is that after January, those people will pop back up again because, again, they need work and they need money for the next year. So make sure before you pay them again, they're on your special vendor list where you get a W-9 before you pay them, because you don't want the same cycle to be happening year after year. Along the similar lines, but why is everyone ignoring me when I ask them for a completed W-9? There is a misconception that if a 1099 isn't produced, you don't have to pay tax on that income, because how is the IRS going to know? That is, unfortunately, false. You're required to pay income tax on income earned in a calendar year, regardless of how you were paid or if it was reported to the IRS. Person's income during the year is what they collect. And if they're ever audited, the IRS will not care about the 1099s that were issued. They're going to look through bank statements, virtual wallets, etc. So we need to make sure that we are covering all of our bases, even if your vendors don't have the same care about W-9s and 1099s that we do. So what time period of payment should be included in the 1099? So the 1099 that you issue to vendors is always for the entire previous calendar year. So we only issue 1099s once per year. So in 2023, we're going to be 1099ing people that you paid from January 1st, 2022 to December 31st, 2022. That's why we can't even really get started on 1099s or anything yet, because payments are still hitting for another 9 or 10 days or so. So we can't even actually start the process of gathering totals or anything until the end of the year, once everything is recorded. So do I need to pay someone more than $600 in a year to 1099 them? Yes, the limit for 1099 NECs is $600. And it also doesn't matter if you pay them $6 100 different times or $600 one time during the year. They still need a 1099, and that 1099 is still going to say $600. Unless they're a corporation, then you don't need to issue them a 1099. Can I just pay somebody $599 10 times a year to avoid the 1099 requirement? That's a good thought, but no, unfortunately, it's a total of the entire year. So it doesn't matter if you're trying to stay under the limits of the $600 requirement. The IRS could care less about how many times or how frequently they were paid. They're just looking at that full calendar year and what the total payments made were. Do I need a 1099 someone that I paid via check, bank transfer, bill pay, cash? Yes. Anything you show as an expense on your return, you want to have a 1099 as proof. Do I need to 1099 someone that was paid as a W-2 employee? Absolutely not. So W-2 is for payroll wages paid to an employee during the calendar year, but it's not for any subcontractor or 1099 payments. So similarly, a 1099 shouldn't include any wage or payroll payments, because otherwise the IRS is going to be looking to tax that money twice. So make sure, especially in some years, you have a transition where there's a vendor that you eventually hire on to be a full-time employee, whether that's just a business decision or it's easier for them, whatever the case may be. Make sure you're correctly splitting those payments so that you're not double counting anything in the transition. Do I need to issue 1099s for interest that I paid? So yes, you should issue 1099 interest to the person or business that you paid during the year, indicating in box 1 how much you paid. However, remember, corporations are exempt from needing 1099s. So you don't need to worry about 1099ing your Amex or Chase or Wells Fargo credit card companies. But think of loans from other small businesses, from friends and family, any loans to an individual or a closely held entity that is not a corporation should have a 1099 interest produced so that, again, that entity or that person shows that income on their tax return. Do I need to issue 1099s for rent? Yes, similar idea with a 1099 miscellaneous. It should be issued to your landlord, indicating in box 1 how much in total rent for the year that you paid. The only instance you don't need to do this is obviously if they're a corporation. How about a 1099 to a foreign vendor? So as long as the vendor isn't a US taxpayer, the services are performed outside of the United States, then there is no 1099 requirement. So you don't need to worry about issuing a 1099 to these vendors. Do I need to issue a 1099 to a vendor for expense reimbursement? So this is something that we see often with a lot of clients. And the answer is the easiest thing is to split up the payments. Split the payments between what they earn for services and what expenses you're reimbursing them for. So let me explain why. So as long as they're paid in a separate check, you don't need to include the expense reimbursements as a part of the 1099. So if you paid a vendor $500 for services in one check and $125 for a parking reimbursement in another check, they're under that $600 service threshold limit. So you actually don't need to 1099 them for the year for either of those payments. But if you cut them a check for $625 in one check for both of those expenses, that's okay, but we're going to issue a 1099 for that full amount of $625. And then what that vendor will do is they'll claim the $125 expense on their business tax return, so that the actual amount that they receive, the net that they're taxed on, is only the $500. But if the reimbursement is put in the same check as that service payment, we're always going to include it. Because again, if we're looking back at your payments and we're like, how come there was a $625 check cut, but you only 1099 this person for $500, or you didn't 1099 this person at all? What's the deal? The IRS is going to have some questions that would be a lot easier to explain if you just issued the 1099 and covered your bases. And sometimes vendors get this, what they think is an inflated 1099, and they're like, well, what do I do? You guys screwed this up. Not realizing that all they have to do, since they put that $125 expense out of their pocket anyway, is claim that expense against the income, and it'll net to the same $500. Let's talk about some examples of vendors that need to be issued a 1099. So we have a web design vendor that was paid $5,000 in the calendar year via checks. The entity is a partnership, so they would definitely need a 1099. Not only are they over the limit of $600, they're also not a corporation. They were paid for services. Again, this is web design, so this is definitely a perfect example of a candidate for a 1099 NEC. We also have a graphic design vendor that was paid $625 in the calendar year, paid via bill pay. So that entity is a single member LLC, so also would need a 1099 because they're not a corp and they're over the $600. And then lastly, we have a photography vendor who was paid $1,500. They were paid via personal Venmo, and the entity is a sole proprietorship. So they would definitely need a 1099. The fact that they weren't paid via business Venmo means that we should assume that Venmo is not going to issue them a 1099, and we should instead issue it for them. We also have your landlord. So your landlord was paid maybe $12,000 in the calendar year via checks. They're a single member LLC, not a corporation. So they would receive a 1099 miscellaneous, showing the total amount of rent that you paid. And then lastly, your aunt who loaned the business some money and you paid her back principal plus $750 in interest. She was paid via bill pay, and she's just your aunt. She's just a sole proprietorship. She's not in business to loan money. So you would definitely receive a 1099 interest statement that she would then put on her 1040 just as she received interest from a bank account. And here we have some examples of vendors that do not need a 1099. So first up is the landscaper that worked on your home's exterior. So this is a service, but it has no business purpose. So this person doesn't need to be 1099. And this also should not be included as a business expense on your books. How about a virtual assistant that was paid $10,000 in the calendar year via bill pay, but the entity is set up as an S corporation. So the only reason they don't need a 1099 is because of that S corp. If they were a sole proprietor or a partnership, they would definitely need to be 1099 because they're over the $600 limit. But as soon as we see that they're an S corporation, no need to worry about issuing a 1099 to them. How about a handyman that was paid $500 in the calendar year via check, and you know that they're a single member LLC? Well, since you didn't get to that $600 threshold, there's actually no need to issue a 1099. It's always good, even if you have these smaller vendors, to get W-9s because you never know if you have to call them back later in the year and it's another $500 charge, and then all of a sudden you're over your $600 threshold, and now you need to try to reach out to them and get a W-9 from them. So even if you're not sure that you're going to reach that $600 threshold, it's still a great business practice to have that on file, to know who you're paying, have the W-9 signed by them saying that this is their business name and EIN, and this is how they're organized and set up, so that you have that on file for your records. Because you never know when you might break that $600 limit, and then it becomes a pain to chase after these vendors. And lastly, a lawyer that was paid $5,200 in the calendar year via business Venmo. The entity is also a corporation. So there's a no 1099 requirement because of the corporation aspect. Plus, we know with 2022 that business Venmo will actually be issuing 1099Ks to these vendors anyway. So another reason we don't need to worry about issuing a 1099, because they'll definitely get one from Venmo directly. All right, so in summary, 1099s are a good thing because they let you prove the tax deductions that you're taking. Vendors don't like receiving them, obviously, but it's not a bad thing. They should be claiming tax on or they should be claiming the income on their tax return anyway. So it's honestly not a big deal. It's just a formality. Get W-9s from every vendor before paying them. I'm sounding like a broken record to myself even, but this is so important. And this is every year, this is the biggest challenge that we face, is trying to track down those last couple subcontractors that are ghosting you. And then make sure every year you're issuing 1099s to everyone that you can. Again, just to cover your bases. And in case you're ever audited, there's no question that you picked and chose who you wanted to issue 1099s to. All right, so we have time for some bonus content. So let's talk about some 1099 and W9 good best practices. So get W9s from every vendor before paying them. And then I recommend saving them in a vendors folder within your administrative files. I always recommend some kind of file sharing system like Dropbox, Box, Google Drive. Within that, with all your other admin documents, should be a vendors folder. I like to see them organized by year of payment. And just every time you pay somebody in the new year, drop in their W9. It's good to get them even every year, every other year, because business addresses change, people's business structures change, things are changing, and you want to make sure you're still issuing to the correct business name and the correct vendor. So I always recommend saving these W9s in a folder in your admin files by year so that you can keep them organized come 1099 time, or if you ever need to look back and see why you issued the 1099 to that vendor and what was on their actual W9. Every time you submit a payment to the vendor that you would need to W9, that you would need to 1099, I highly recommend saving that W9 to the current year vendor folder. And what else should be in that admin folder? So easily accessible to you at all times. You want your EIN letter, articles of incorporation or organization from your state, any elections that you made at the federal level. You want to have your own W9 as a business on file when vendors ask you for it. So you want to have something ready and available to give to them when they ask for your information. You want to have any copies of your payroll tax account numbers, sales tax account numbers, tax returns, rent and lease agreements, all that kind of operating information that you need to reference every now and again. You also, it's a great idea to have things like your employee handbooks, employee related documents. And then these days, especially with so many systems and logins and information everywhere, it's good to have a description or at least some kind of guide as to where everything is hiding, what's buried where, what system do you use for this process, what system do you use for this, how do you get to here? If you need to look into something for an employee, how do you do that? If you need to look into something for a vendor, how do you do that? Just in case anything happens to you as the owner, it's good to have a kind of organized group of information should anybody need to look into it and kind of take over while you're out. Now let's talk about the most important thing, and selfishly why this was created in the first place, how you can submit your 1099 info to us. Because we're obviously in charge of making sure that we're filing the 1099s on your behalf, making sure that the IRS is happy with what they received, and making sure from a compliance standpoint, you got nothing to worry about. Unfortunately, we need your help in getting that 1099 info to us. So know that our website, engagecpas.com, under the resources tab is client forms. And every year we always post all of our client forms right on our website so that you can just find them here and access them whenever you need them. So under 1099 info collection, you're going to want to click form. That's going to take you to our form where you're going to help us gather the information. We also have a video walkthrough that you can follow along with. But I'll kind of just walk you through the couple steps now to get us the info. And you can see that for 2022, 1099 information is due to us by 1/22 to allow Heather and myself to have enough time to get everything filed in that last week of the month. So as soon as you click on the 1099 info collection form, you're going to get taken to a page that looks like this. In the very top, we're just collecting information about your business. So the entity that's actually issuing the 1099s. So you're going to tell us whether or not you have an EIN first. If you have an EIN, we're going to issue it from the business name. If you click no, that you don't have an EIN, these fields will change to what's your full name and what's your social security number. But essentially, this is what's going to show in the top left of the 1099 NECs that we issue, saying where the 1099 is coming from. So we need your business name, EIN, address, phone number, email, that basic information. And then the second part is just telling us all about your contractors. So you start with one contractor. You can click add a contractor here to add as many more as you need. But for every contractor, we ask the same question. Is this an individual that you're paying? If so, tell us their first and last name and their social. Is it an LLC or a partnership or some other entity with an EIN? If you click that button, this will change to business name and EIN. So we'll need the name and identification number, the address, the amount that they were paid in total in 2022, their email address, because that's actually how we issue the 1099s. They're no longer paper filed. They're all e-filed directly to the IRS and sent to the subcontractors at the same time. And then lastly, we need to know what the payment was for. So again, we talked about the 3 different forms. It's very important that we put the correct payments on the correct forms. Because if you paid somebody interest and we give them a 1099 NEC for subcontracting, the IRS is going to look for that to be showing as if it was business income and not interest income, which is taxed very differently because of Social Security and Medicare taxes. So we want to make sure that we get this correct and indicate which payments were made for which category of expenses. So after you have all the information filled out here, you can upload their W-9 if you have it and you want to give us a copy. Otherwise, we trust you to fill this out. And then you just click add a subcontractor. And once you do so, you'll get taken, just drop down another box. You'll see subcontractor number 2, and you can repeat that entire process. Fill out their name, their social, address, the amount paid, and their email address. And then once you're all done, you have all your subcontractors added. You submit the form to us, and we'll take care of the rest.